All right, going to open up the floor to questions, either to Bob, Ian, or all three. Rocco, I was going to say.
Sorry, somebody else.
Yeah. Brian? Maybe podium.
My question to these fellows is through Carl. He's still back there, isn't he? I just wondered whether or not State Farm would consider the Bastrop fire to be a one-off. You know, my suspicion is that they don't think of it as a one-off, and I'm not sure if that's influenced by their past experience in the U.S. that we don't have here in Canada, or whether it's influenced somewhat by a better awareness of what the future looks like. So that's really kind of my question. I think one of the differences we're seeing here is that we're still somehow, from an insurance standpoint, regarding what happened in Slave Lake or Kelowna as a one-off, and that I think is a very dangerous attitude to take at this point in time. And I'm just wondering whether at the end of this meeting we might be able to learn something from the U.S. example.
So can we learn from the U.S.? Should we learn from the U.S.? What are the learnings? What can we take away from some of the things happening south of the border? Do we need to experience the loss physically in order to learn from it, or can we learn from others elsewhere?
I'll give you an answer. It's interesting how communities react. So, for example, with the ICLR, we've been to Jasper to see a community that's engaged to try to make it a fire-safe community, and you see individual homeowners taking actions to try to prevent what happened in Kelowna and Barrier. And it seems as though Kelowna and Barrier had a real impact on Jasper's mentality, and so that community is engaged. But what is the geographical range you have to travel from Kelowna and Barrier to have no impact? We've heard some examples where there are other communities, the Cold Lake, that doesn't think that it could happen there. But it just happened over there, it just happened over there, so why would you think that? And in terms of how insurers react, I think every insurance company follows a bit of a different path. I know that we have a connection with our AAA friends and CAA friends and so on, so we get together and we talk about our catastrophic models. We have a catastrophic group that meets to try to learn from each other, because as we've heard about shifting weather patterns, we might see more activity of types that we haven't seen before. In terms, whether it's wildfire or wind events, we might see them with more frequency. And we just had a big windstorm in southern Alberta at the end of November, which is kind of unheard of at that time of the year. But we do try to learn from each other in that sense. The thing that I'd be really interested in is we heard earlier about maybe engaging the government to raise budgets by considering what the loss dollars are. And as an insurer, this is where I'm not so optimistic. I'm a little bit more cynical. Usually when people look at insured loss, it's out of sight, out of mind. You know, people think about their rates. They often don't think about why their rates are what they are. That actually the loss experience does determine what your rates are going to be at the end. So, anybody else?
Just to further clarify, I agree with you. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, when we're sitting here in this room and there's extremely heightened awareness of the concerns. But I felt it was incumbent upon me to go out into the community and say, well, okay, so what do you think? What are your thoughts about it? And it's abundantly clear to me that there isn't the same level of heightened awareness. So I bring that up because that's a challenge, right? So we can talk a lot in these groups, but the challenge is, to translate that into some kind of awareness and some kind of action to follow that up, and that's a challenge that we're faced with.
Yeah, and just to Troy's point, these information sessions obviously fantastic about taking some of these learnings and bringing it back to some of the key partners in our business. But what Troy was saying before, there's shifting priorities for an insurance company who has 5,000 hail claims reported in a couple of days. Those are the type of events that are probably more likely going to take precedent over incidents like a Slave Lake or Kelowna. The reality, probably, State Farm is a massive company. They have massive exposure. They have the resources, the ability, and a huge amount of experience in the U.S. that they have dedicated departments to certainly go through this. And and we get the benefit of some of their experience and some of their learnings, so that we can eventually start bringing them back into within the Canadian experience.
A question for Paul. A question for Troy and others to the extent that it relates. Troy, you mentioned some of the policyholders that experienced a loss in Slave Lake came to you and said they'd like to rebuild and add some features to their home to make it more resilient to fire. Your sense of what kind of, how many of the homeowners thought that way and came to you with that sort of proposal? Was it a few or was it fairly common?
Well, it was fairly common, and we heard to one extent it's changes in building code over time. So you need a different kind of driveway and so on and so forth. And the way that it is really a custom approach for each claim, right? So we did have the one person who said, "I'm out of here." We actually helped him sort out a real estate agent so that we could get the property sold. He sold it to his neighbor, who we also insure. So that's why we were quite willing to help out, and so he's going to redesign his house. And basically, we treat it as, here's a budget. And for those of you that are not insurance people, insurance policies often have guaranteed replacement cost clauses, and sometimes sometimes you're relatively strict on the parameters of that. But we sort of treat it as, what is a reasonable budget? You have a total loss home. You've got all these things. We just want to put you back in a spot where you're happy. It doesn't have to be exactly what you had before, but we'll work with you to get that done. So it involves a fair bit of effort. These claims are going to be going on for quite some time still, at least another good year and a half, I would say.
I'll just touch on it. We did have we had some of those conversations because we've been involved in your group. Unfortunately, because we had two real experiences of it. The conversations just weren't the target audience for doing that. The one guy we had he elected to move, and then he decided he was going to do something, and then both of them ended up going with prefab homes manufactured out of Edmonton.
Yes, I'd like to sort of approach this more from the risk and insurance management, or the buy side, rather than essentially the insurance side. And I think the concern here is there's a bit of a disconnect from the claims side coming back to the underwriting and the rates, and that everyone's discussing here the claims response, which is great. But you'll have a lot of companies and perhaps individual people who say, well, we have our business continuity plans, we have our emergency plans, and maybe to some extent with the soft market at the moment, we're not getting essentially rate reductions for doing a lot of these things. Most of the things that they get are rate reductions for what would be hard or physical augmentations to their physical plant or to their homes. But for some of the softer methods, there doesn't appear to be much impetus on this, and I guess that dovetails into the other concern that I think was brought up, that a lot of this doesn't make it even back into the underwriting or the rates, and this perception of one-off, or just perception of that this is the way things are. So I'm just wondering, how are you going to make this back from almost a claims-based response, circle it round back into the underwriting?
I'll go. As an outcome of this, what we did is we did bring in MSB, and we did go through a baseline study for insurance to value in Slave Lake and surrounding area, so that we could try to get those values correct. And what we learned from that is In some circumstances, the calculator is not working correctly for us, given the nature of those properties. In other circumstances, what we find is that our agency force just isn't using the tool correctly. And so we went through that exercise to try to get that value piece quite correct. So we actually did physically bring underwriters with us and go with the MSB guys so that they could get a sense of what the ordeal is going to be like for rebuilding, to understand what a complete loss looks like, including the loss of all your trees and shrubs and everything else, right? So it's a complete loss in the absolute sense. So we've spent a lot of time trying to close that loop with underwriting, to what degree some of those findings and some of the changes in building construction are really going to find their way into the pricing model. I can't speak to that directly, but of course, as a member of the ICLR, I certainly think that these things should have an impact. The same as for wind, the same as what you're doing to manage your flood exposure, or your water backup, your sewer backup exposure. I think all those things should have some impact on your pricing, because I think that's the way to engage the public, right? So if we're talking about a cohesive strategy where the community, the individuals, and the insurance companies are working together to reduce risk, I think there has to be some incentive to try to motivate individuals to do that.
Following along, that vein of thought, in areas that we're very familiar with and have a lot of claims experience with, which would be wind, hail, water, any initiatives that are taken by a homeowner to mitigate those kinds of things had been recognized actually for some time. Exactly how they translate into the premium, I couldn't begin to tell you, but there's not that much experience with wildfire, notwithstanding the devastating loss in Kelowna and Slave Lake. And so I think that those initiatives just simply haven't worked their way through the system. And I'm not too sure how long it would take to work their way through the system at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fairly similar response from the RBC side as well. It's most of the strategy was directed around replacement cost. It's typical. I mean, when you see these events or prices go up, and then people start to look at, God, we rolled this house for $100,000 less than it would have been. I mean, I would think most of my colleagues here, and the State Farm experience too. You go back, you revisit, you look at how you look at your response, and you look at what those things that they don't typically factor in. You look at the vegetation, you look at the driveway, everything's absolutely gone, and those are the things that really should be considered when you're developing those replacement costs. So that's pretty much from that approach.
I should add, the thing that actually made my underwriting colleague the most upset was we lost a lot of vehicles as well, right? So, and he just couldn't understand it at all, because he was looking at it like, but there's 2 drivers in the house and they have 2 vehicles and they're being evacuated. Why didn't they take both vehicles? I'm like, yeah, well, what's going to happen? My wife and I'm going to say, you take the kids and off you go. I'll meet you at random evacuation center. Who knows if our house is going to be completely destroyed? I don't think it's likely to happen, but that was the thing that made him most upset.
So just in relating to the overall theme of climate change, to what degree does the insurance industry, take into account climate change as a factor in terms of premiums, et cetera? We're all aware that the engineering profession has completely rejigged all their standards for floods, major weather events, et cetera. Is the insurance industry doing similar things?
Short answer is no. It isn't factored in whatsoever. I mean, we are, our rate making is based on statistical evidence from past events. And so climate change is certainly looking forward. And, climate change as such, I mean, it's obvious you don't get unanimous agreement as to whether it's anthropogenic or whatever. it doesn't really matter. You know, if it appears to be changing and the experience is such that we are into a new environment with regard to greater catastrophes, more numerous catastrophes, that will eventually make its way through it, and that's the way it's going to happen, but not some kind of a forward-looking possibility. And so I don't believe that specifically is a factor at all.
I would suggest that in sort of an indirect way there is an impact in that most insurers have some plan of reinsurance working in the background, which is either designed to manage individual losses or catastrophic events. And certainly our reinsurers are very much focused on climate change and all kinds of other things, and even the readiness of municipalities to manage certain losses, particularly looking at the state of infrastructure for individual municipalities to manage big water losses and so on. But even with wildfire, I'm sure that they're interested, and in as much as their research is affecting their view of the likelihood or the propensity for catastrophic losses, it's affecting how they're rating themselves, which impacts what our reinsurance costs are, which impacts what our rates are. So in a roundabout way, it is something that is considered, I think.
Hi, my name is Jamie Coots, and I'm the fire chief for the town of Slave Lake. So I'm not sure if that makes me a chunk of meat in a room full of alligators or an alligator in a room full of meat. We'll see as the day progresses here. But my question to you is this. One of the biggest barriers we have moving forward with the Fire Smart program, which you're going to hear a lot about here today, is that people say, you know, I live in this area, it's beautiful, I want to live where it's beautiful, and I'm not worried about fire because I have insurance. You know, I hear about State Farm, and he talks about the assessments and some of those things, and dropping. I think the number was 1% because people didn't want to do anything to improve their situation. So I guess I'm curious what you guys, maybe representing everybody here, feel about that comment. You know, I'll live in this place and I'm good because I have insurance.
Well, that's not an unusual comment whatsoever. We hear that all the time. And that's somewhat true, right? If they do have insurance. Sort of speaking to the State Farm analysis of encroachment onto wildlands and the potential danger that might cause, I'm not aware that in Canada we have an industry-wide tool that allows us to do that. So unless you have, let's say, local knowledge, or some particular reason to think that somebody is in a particular kind of danger as to where they build. Even under, I'm just going to change sort of horses in midstream here, but even under those circumstances, I'm not sure that there would be enough there to say to somebody, we're not going to write you, or we're going to drop you midterm, or we're not going to renew you. I think that would be considered at this stage to be, you know, political dynamite, and I don't think you would hear that coming from an insurer.
I think it's certainly a fair comment. With respect to wildlife fires, it's probably even more so, just because the experience is just not there. I think we have to be cognizant. I mean, we've gone through this with water losses significantly over the last 10 years. Water losses are through the roof, and you know, groups like the ICLR, the social media, a lot of insurance companies have started to create certainly more awareness of that. We need to take those learnings from the water experience, and hopefully eventually get it to start where we're dealing with wildfires. I don't have, you know, a lot of people, I've got insurance, what do I care? I don't have my basement floods. There's a lot of people that no longer have insurance for their basement floods, for sewer backups anymore because of the experience. And, you know, it's generated a lot of, it has started to generate a lot of discussion, both at their municipal level as well, you know, with their insurance, being a direct writer or with their broker. We need to take some of those lessons and continue to push that awareness long after an event, despite the fact that, I mean, what Bob was saying, okay, the event in Kelowna, I'm not worried about it anymore, my house is built, I'm back to normal, but it has to be something that's continually pushed.
I wish I was taller. I think it's awesome actually that people have that peace of mind, because that's what we're trying to do. But to Ian's point, and he's bang on, is that the risk is that insurers make changes to their product so it no longer provides that peace of mind that you think you are fully covered, right? So and particularly on water losses, because that's been it's the most dominant loss for insurers. We're seeing other carriers now that are taking action to either restrict, eliminate, or greatly reduce that coverage, so that in the event of a loss, you may not be fully covered, or you know that it is actually a financial burden on you as an individual. And in the worst case scenario, it's that a policy that provides full coverage is priced such that it becomes unaffordable, and people choose not to have insurance at all. So in terms of lessons learned from other jurisdictions, I mean, that's the cause. I had the opportunity to go to Louisiana with our AAA friends, and the anger that's there is because of the amount of uninsured loss, right? Because of the nature of what occurred, but also because of the pricing of insurance and the availability of insurance, and that creates a whole lot of anger. And maybe that's where it comes full circle to get the government really interested in activities that can mitigate or prevent loss, because what happens in those scenarios is there's a tremendous cash burden on the governments because they've got to respond. So even in Slave Lake, I mean, the government of Alberta was very good in responding very quickly with a big pile of cash, because I think they recognized that there is going to be some portion of uninsured loss that they're going to have to respond to. So in as much as that's a direct cost for them, maybe that gets governments interested in some of that preventive activity.
Hi, I'm gonna approach this a little bit from the commercial point of view, because most of what we heard is only personal lines. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the impact from a commercial point of view. One of the questions that came about and said, is Slave Lake is one-off, and it's not a one-off, but I mean, when insurance companies look at exposures, they have to prioritize. And with all due respect, I mean, the $300 million of Slave Lake, which we are talking about here, is not even close to affecting the commercial and the P&C industry in Canada by any means. And that's why the effect will be very minimal, if any at all. I mean, if we are looking at the other scenarios that we face every day, flooding here in the Manitoba area, the latest windstorm in Alberta, and the probability of the earthquakes that are hovering over BC, then that makes the Slave Lake scenario very, very little or minimal of effect to underwriters, if any. Now, and I tend to disagree with Bob, with all due respect, that insurance companies are not doing anything regarding the global warming. I mean, the wildfire is a very, very small part of the global warming aspect. We are looking at every day at new scenarios regarding flood, which is more or less a direct effect of global warming. We're looking at wind and hurricanes, and there are models that are being used every single day by insurers, by reinsurers to address that. So regular no answer is not really very fair to insurance companies in that respect. The other item about risk and management practices, I agree with the colleague in front that the risk and management practices, and especially when it comes to commercial lines, and with accounts like we mentioned ADCO, and we mentioned, for example, big BC companies like BC Hydro and Dallas and whatever, those guys have very robust risk and management practices, which, again, Peter being part of the BC directory for fire protection or something, it is at the end of the day, I was wondering about the cooperation that you have with those big companies, because they have very big, robust risk and management practices with lots of money thrown there, and maybe it is good that you cooperate on a provincial level with those big companies, because they do have the resources, and I know for sure that they do have their own contingency plans and the resources and the equipment that deals with such an incident. Will a slave lake affect on the underwriting level? I mean, with all due respect, I don't think so. Especially on the personal lines, if you look at personal lines volume of, I don't know, $10 billion. The last point, which is very important, State Farm guys are proactive in that, is that they have very good relations, I think, with the provincial government, and that's why when we talk about the lack of one point nobody mentioned is the lack of the independent adjusters in this scenario. I mean, the insurance companies have their claims people, but the independent adjusters in the Slave Lake scenario were very rare to find. And the province said, okay, nobody can go in until you nominate your independent adjuster, and there was no independent adjusters available to, and that's why there was a big delay in adjusting the claims on the commercial side as well. So these are some points that we have to consider, of course, as insurance companies, and going forward, and at the same time, enhance the relationship with the provincial and the local municipalities, because the ATCO people could go in because they are in relationship with those guys day in, day out throughout the year, and they have access. While insurance companies, we play a very reactive role. We don't have any claims people in that area, and when something happens, and we don't have any relationship with any local government, and when something happens, all we care about is to go in. And I agree with the chief. I mean, basically, the priorities are different. For the chief, the priorities is saving lives. The property damage comes later. So if we have to wait for 1 week to enter to the site, then that's fine. Thank you.
There's a lot of comments there. One that I would pick out to talk about is the independent adjusters and their ability to respond. And there's been a fair bit of activity through the IBC and so on to reduce the barriers between different jurisdictions in terms of the mobility of adjusters, so that independent adjusting firms can send adjusters from Ontario to Alberta with the minimum amount of red tape to get through, so they can respond more quickly. Our company, it wasn't so much of a concern because we have a fair staff presence. We were able to respond to most claims that way. But we did use some independent adjusters, and our model really was, again, I guess everything I learned here in Ontario. It was the way that we had responded to the Peterborough floods when they occurred here. Which was basically to say, given our size and market share and our pull on those types of resources, we're just not going to be first in line for those types of adjusting resources. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to boutique independent adjuster in Toronto and say, guess what, we got you a hotel room, and you're our person in Peterborough now. We did the same thing in this case. We took some independent adjusters from Calgary and were able to house them temporarily. No, not in Slave Lake, obviously, but outside of that area, so they could respond and be there on a daily basis. So there's all kinds of different strategies. I guess we've got agreements with our sister operations in BC and Ontario as well, to be able to get resources from them. In those circumstances, though, what we would typically do is we bring in those resources, we make them work on our regular claims. so that our very own staff that are familiar with that area have the freedom and mobility to go and respond directly. So that's what we do.
Just, I see time is marching on. It wasn't an issue for us. We brought in a team from Kelowna Wholesale. They cut their teeth on the Kelowna fires, and we brought them into Slave Lake, and they did a masterful job for us. To the extent that our biggest broker there gets inquiries daily about insuring with our company, so we're very, very pleased with their response there. So really, the availability of independent adjusters was not a big issue in the final analysis. They were there early. We were just waiting to get access to the sites. Our biggest frustration was lack of timely access to the sites. And I'm not saying that it wasn't warranted. That was just the frustration that we experienced in trying to keep our insured satisfied.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up, but just very, very quickly, in your minds, how did the industry do? How does it continue to do in Slave Lake from A+ to an F? How did we do?
How did we do? I think we did. I think we did an amazing job from a response.
A+ to an F.
A.
I thought the response, and I would call the response something that the insurance industry plus the municipality plus the Alberta government plus all these other resources around it. I would say that it was a very good response. And notwithstanding that the newspaper today is talking about an audit that they're going to do on how effective the response was, I would give it a B+ though, just because I think there's always room for improvement.
Are you going to run for office soon?
I think basically, if I speak for our own company, I know I'm tooting our own horn here, but it was definitely an A+ for us. We threw a lot of time, energy, and resources at that to make sure that everybody was taken care of. In general, the response from the insurance industry, I think, was at least an A. It was very difficult, but I think they did everything they could possibly do.
Great. Thanks, gentlemen. That was excellent.